I have to say, Battle for Azeroth has a lot going for it. I've said in previous videos that the story has become progressively a stronger part of the game since Mists, and it seems to be getting even stronger in Battle for Azeroth, even affecting the world that we play in brand new ways that we never would have seen coming. There's probably more than we would expect going on in Kul Tiras and Zandalar too, and there's opportunities for world building and epic fights on those islands. But the thing that has me the most excited about Battle for Azeroth is how Blizzard is undoing some of the lameness they've inflicted on the player base over the years, returning trimmed abilities. Now, I can understand why Blizzard needs to trim abilities now and then. There's only 12 buttons available on the spell bar. I mean, what are they going to do? Make backspace another ability hotkey? If they wanted to add something new, they have to remove something to make room for it. And some spells being merged with other effects just makes things more convenient. Blessing of Light and Seal of the Crusader, abilities that boosted our heals and our holy damage respectively in vanilla, come to mind. They got removed in Wrath of the Lich King, and no one really missed them because their boost effects got baked into our abilities, and it was one less mutually exclusive buff or debuff to worry about. But there have been some really cool abilities that I was sorry to see go, and whose absence I've sorely felt in the situations where they'd be really useful. You know I'll harp on Consecration and Denounce, but I think I should talk about why I harp on those so much. This is going to take some context. First of all, I've played a Holy Paladin since vanilla, and believe it or not, my favorite expansion of them all was Cataclysm. I'm not joking. Part of the reason I enjoyed Cataclysm so much is undoubtedly because I tried my hand at hardcore raiding in that expansion. And while that lasted, before guild-killing drama obliterated the guild, it was actually really fun. I have so many other demands on my free time these days that I can't really get back into hardcore WoW, but at the time I did enjoy it, brief as my foray was. But alongside that was what happened to Holy Paladins in Cataclysm. When Blizzard made the transition from Wrath to Cataclysm, there were a few paradigm shifts in their design that happened to benefit Holy Paladins in a lot of different ways. First, their philosophy about healers in Wrath was that they should be pigeonholed into specific roles. Holy was the tank healing role. We had very little along the lines of group healing in Wrath, so when Blizzard decided that all healing specs should be able to group heal in Cataclysm, they had to add 2 new group heals to Holy's kit to make that happen. Secondly, they were standardizing healing so that every spec had a fast, inefficient heal, a slow, efficient heal, and a large heal that had a medium efficiency to it. In Wrath, Paladins had only 2 single-target healing spells besides Holy Shock, so Blizzard had to add 1 more heal to our kits to get Holy standardized. Third, Blizzard was adding Holy Power to all 3 Paladin specs at the time, and wanted a heal that used Holy Power, so we got a 4th new heal. After 2 expansions where Blizzard was very reluctant to give us another healing button to press, getting 4 brand spanking new healing spells felt like Blizzard was making up for lost time. But the story doesn't end there. In Cataclysm, Blizzard had only invented about 3 ways to get a spell onto a player's spell bar. A. Make it a class ability that all specs would get. B. Make it a perk that you get upon choosing the spec, and pretty much they could only add 1 active ability per spec that way. Or C. Make it a talent. Blizzard hadn't yet invented spec-specific abilities, so if there was an ability that they wanted 2 specs to have and 1 spec not to have, tough luck for Blizzard because that 3rd spec was getting it. That meant that a lot of abilities were on my spellbar that were normally used by other specs. Holy Wrath, Consecration, Exorcism, Rebuke, Divine Plea, Inquisition, all of those were on my spellbar, even though most of those spells were used by Retribution and Protection more often than by Holy. These extra abilities also made it more flexible about what I could do and how I could contribute to the group. I could, for instance, interrupt a Dejara while she was channeling a spell that could have wiped the party. But more than that, spells actually made soloing much more fun. Mobbed by enemies? No problem. Consecration and Holy Wrath meant I didn't need to single target them all. Fighting flying enemies or enemies that wouldn't let me get into melee? No problem. Exorcism had no cooldown in Cataclysm, which was another thing I loved about Cataclysm. Paladins lacked an on-demand ranged damage ability with no cooldown up until Cataclysm, and I was thrilled to get one at very long last. Having played since vanilla, I have played a paladin that has neither AoE damage nor a no cooldown ranged ability. I've played a paladin who has an AoE damage ability but lacked a no cooldown ranged ability. I've played a paladin who has both AoE damage and a no cooldown ranged ability, and I've played a paladin who has just a no cooldown ranged ability yet lacked AoE damage. Of those four, having both at my disposal was by far the most fun. So obviously, one of the biggest things on my wish list for what they'll untrim is some kind of ranged damage. But even more than that, I'm crossing my fingers that I'm not going to lose Consecration again. That would suck. I'll get into that later. For now, here are some abilities I'd like to see make a comeback, starting with the ones I least care about, going up to the ones I most care about. Seal of Wisdom and Judgment of Wisdom were cool abilities from vanilla that let you regenerate mana when you smack an enemy with your weapon. The difference is that Seal of Wisdom was a self buff, while Judgment of Wisdom was a debuff that let anyone who hits your target recover mana. I liked being able to do that. It's one of the things I miss about vanilla, though, as you remember from my last video, there's also plenty of class design from vanilla that I don't miss. Divine Plea felt like a cool tool for replenishing my mana during a fight tool while it lasted. But then, I'm not sure that the resource system in Battle for Azeroth is going to work well with these concepts, which is why they're at the bottom of my list. Overall, I feel like Holy Paladins could use a little help with group healing. I'm not sure that adding another group healing button is the right way to accomplish that, so that's why Holy Radiance is near the bottom of my list. Now, Holy Radiance actually has a lot of different versions to it. The original version of it from Cataclysm had a 20 or 30 second cooldown and caused the Paladin to radiate out healing to his allies over time, over several seconds. Later, Cataclysm took off the cooldown and made it a timed cast spell that made an ally radiate healing over time, over a shorter period. In Mists, it became a timed cast heal. Eventually, it felt the same as all of our other timed cast heals, which made me not miss Holy Radiance when Legion took it out. Then, of course, there's what Uther does in Heroes of the Storm, which is nothing like how it ever was in World of Warcraft at any point. So, if Blizzard wanted to add another group healing button for Holy Paladins, there are a lot of ways they could implement Holy Radiance that wouldn't need to create the same problems that Holy Radiance had in Warlords of Draenor. Above Holy Radiance on my list, and a lot more likely, is Rebuke. Again, it was halfway through Cataclysm that I received the Rebuke ability on my spell bar, and it made me feel more like a melee class. It even let me use the kick animation for a little while. I liked it, and since Blizzard is pushing harder than ever for Holy Paladins to be melee healers, adding a melee interrupt would make us feel more like a melee spec and give us more things that we can contribute while we're in melee. Also, it helps while soloing. A little. Second from the top is the Exorcism spell. I've said it before and I'll say it again. Exorcism contributes a lot of class flavor for Paladins, and Paladins had an Exorcism spell when they were first brought into the Warcraft universe in the Warcraft 2 real-time strategy game. So I think that in some way, Exorcism should be brought back. One suggestion a lot of other players liked was adding a cosmetic glyph that changes Blade of Justice into Exorcism. It'd have the same damage, the same range, the same effects, but a different animation, different sound, and a different name. Of course, that's not the only way to re-add Exorcism. It could be re-added as a no cooldown ranged damage ability, a little bit like what it was in Cataclysm, which leads me to my number one item on my wish list that hasn't already been added or that remains in Battle for Azeroth. Some kind of no cooldown ranged damage ability for Paladins. There were so many times in Legion where I couldn't get into melee while soloing, whether it's because of pushback mechanics or flying enemies or just plain needing to stay out of the fire, and at those moments I sorely miss Denounce. Don't get me wrong, I do not miss Denounce spam from Warlords of Draenor and Mists, and I like having a more dynamic damage system. But there are ways that Denounce or another ranged damage ability with no cooldown could be brought back without bringing Denounce spam back. Having played since vanilla, and having played one of the few specs in existence that used to have a no cooldown range damage ability and lacks one now, I believe very strongly that every spec in the game should have at least one ranged damage ability with no cooldown and at least one AoE ability with either no cooldown or a short cooldown. Those abilities are needed for dealing with situations that pop up while soloing. That brings me to what would have been the number one thing on my list if Blizzard hadn't already added it by the time I started on this video. The number one thing on my wish list was actually that Discipline Priests receive some form of AoE damage ability. That's right, the top item on my wish list was actually for a spec that I don't even play. That's because I went through the lameness of having no AoE damage abilities in my kit in Mists and Warlords, and it sucked. There were crowds of low hit point enemies that I knew I was supposed to burn down with AoE attacks, but I didn't have any. That sucked so much that when Legion's changes came and the one spec who lacks AoE flag passed from Holy Paladins to Disciplined Priests, I could hardly believe it, and I was definitely feeling their pain, and I did not want that lameness to continue. Thank the light that it's over, because Holy Nova has finally been given back to Disciplined Priests. With that change, every spec in the game has at least one multi-target damage ability with either no cooldown or a fairly short cooldown that it can use when dealing with packs of low hit point enemies. Now that is progress. As for the other half of my philosophy that every spec should have at least one range damage ability with no cooldown, the majority of classes have at least one such ability. As a matter of fact, when Blizzard redesigns a spec or creates a whole new spec, they usually have at least one ranged ability with no cooldown in the mix. Poison Knife for Assassins, Hatchet Toss for Survival, Pistol Shot for Outlaw, Crackling Jade Lightning for Monks, Death's Caress for Blood Death Knights, the list goes on. In fact, there are only 3 classes that don't have a ranged ability with no cooldown: Demon Hunters, Warriors, and Paladins. Granted, each of those classes still have access to a ranged ability that's helpful: Glaive Throw, Heroic Throw, and Judgment respectively. And while it could be said that adding or modifying an ability so that they have a ranged damage ability with no cooldown would be situational at best, the same could be said for Poison Knife, Hatchet Toss, and Crackling Jade Lightning. There's another reason to add an ability to each of those classes beyond the conveniences of dealing with flying enemies and enemies with weird mechanics, and that is flavor. I've already talked about the class flavor Paladins could get by the return of Exorcism, but Demon Hunters could get a lot of flavor out of bringing back something based on mana burn, which, as the name implies, took mana away from its target and dealt damage equal to the amount of mana destroyed. That was a Demon Hunter spell all the way back in Warcraft 3. Mana burn might not work well with the resource systems now in place in WoW, but a green bolt of lightning spell would be great. It would be a flavorful addition to Demon Hunter's kits, even if it's only used in occasions where a Demon Hunter can't get into melee. For warriors, there's potential for race flavor. Imagine every warrior getting a different ability depending on their race. For instance, Night Elves could get a longbow shot ability, Trolls could get an axe toss ability, Dwarves a blunderbuss shot ability, Orcs a spear toss ability, the list goes on. And yes, spear throwing is a bigger part of the Orcish racial identity than you'd think. Orc worker units could go into burrows and throw spears at enemies in Warcraft 3, and in Warcraft 1, the Orcish ranged unit was a spear thrower. With new races being a big deal in Battle for Azeroth, a little something extra to give each race some extra flavor is probably a good idea, and giving warriors a race-specific ranged ability, even if it'll only be used situationally, would be an excellent way to add that. You know, I suppose at some point I should stop harping on my class's kit for soloing and start talking about its core function instead, healing, and now seems like as good a time as any. Blizzard, by and large, solved the issues that Holy Paladins had in Warlords when Legion came out. Before, every heal felt the same. Almost all 1.5 second cast time heals that differed only in terms of which resources they consumed and how many targets they affected. After the Legion revamp, our heals felt different from each other and worked well as a functioning kit. The one thing I was worried about going into Legion was group healing, and while we may be less effective than other healers at group healing, I've discovered in practice that we're not so ineffective that it becomes a problem in 5-mans. On the whole, I'd say Holy Paladins are in a pretty good place when it comes to their healing kits, and my only real concern going into Battle for Azeroth is, once again, group healing. Light of Dawn received a lot of buffs through our artifact weapon, probably because it was, and so far is, our only non-talent group healing ability. With artifact weapons going away and taking Tyr's Munificence with them as well, I think Light of Dawn will need some help in Battle for Azeroth, preferably in a way that doesn't rely on the random number gods. Lowering its cooldown is one option. Another option is adding another group healing button like I mentioned before while I was talking about Holy Radiance, and still another option is adding Azerite perks to Light of Dawn in one way or another. I'm not sure what the best idea is, and I'm not even sure Light of Dawn will need as much help as I think it does, but it's my biggest concern as far as Holy Paladin healing goes. For talents, I have been using Aura of Mercy because it's our only group heal that doesn't have a cooldown, and the main reason I didn't like Aura of Sacrifice is because it didn't actually lower the total damage that my group takes. Battle for Azeroth changes that, so I might try Sacrifice out. I wish that I didn't need to pick between Judgment of Light and Holy Prism. I expect I'll stick with Holy Prism simply because I prefer the playstyle of having another damage button. And I like the way that it kind of marks targets for the DPS in looking for raid. Nothing says attack this mob like a golden healing laser flying out of it. From my perspective, the Avenging Wrath tier is kind of a game changer. I tend not to pay much attention to Avenging Wrath, but I love the damage for healing mechanic. I've wanted one for a long time for paladins. I was talking about how Light of Dawn needs some help, and it gets some help with Awakening, but I have to wonder whether that's the best way to play it. This actually reminds me a lot of the current artifact weapon talent Sacred Dawn, which boosts the healing that targets of your Light of Dawn spell get by 10% for the 6 seconds after you cast it. This is like that, except it applies to all your healing, not just to targets affected by Light of Dawn. It isn't guaranteed to kick in, and it lasts longer. Yeah, I think there were probably better ways to implement this. One thing that concerns me about talent changes is that I wish Beacon of the Lightbringer weren't gone. I liked the positioning flexibility that Lightbringer gave me. I could heal someone other than the tank and melee with that talent, and now it's gone. I'm not sure what exactly I'd throw out to make room for that talent either. The other talents seem to hang together a little too well to throw them out and put Beacon of the Lightbringer in its place. While I don't like having this change thrust upon me, I know I'll adapt, but I have to say that making positioning while healing so important means Denounce or Exorcism is more important than ever. With the flexibility gone in where we can stand, it'd be nice if we could have something in our kits that allowed us to deal damage regardless of positioning, especially if it worked with Avenging Crusader. Anyhow, those are my thoughts on the changes we're seeing in Battle for Azeroth so far.